So help me God.
In 1991, there were no fewer than 4 living ex-presidents of the United States. The Commission on the Bicentennial of the Constitution recorded interviews with each of them, which we've re-edited to present here a unique testimony to 2 decades of power, as experienced by Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan.
The only way, really, that the president has to relay his views to the American people, to use a so-called bully pulpit, is through the press.
Well, presidents have to learn to live with the press, whether it's right or wrong.
What I wanted were judges in the Supreme Court who interpreted the law, who did not write new laws.
Too many bureaucrats think that they should make the decisions. And too many of them get too big for their britches.
Last time we heard what the 4 ex-presidents said about their relationship with Congress. Now we're going to look at how they get on with the Supreme Court, with the federal bureaucracy, and with the media. Bob McKeever is with me again to help explain the issues and draw out the evidence in the interviews. Bob, what do you think are the other key relationships that the presidency has?
Well, as we've said, Congress is the most important one, but that doesn't mean to say there aren't others which are also critical to the success or failure of any presidency. The ones that I think we should concentrate most on would be the judiciary, particularly the United States Supreme Court, which, after all, has the power to interpret the Constitution, and, if necessary, to declare acts of a president unconstitutional. Then again, there's the federal bureaucracy. There's a vast number of bureaucrats in Washington, civil servants, as we tend to call them here, who are supposed to carry out the president's will, who is the head of the administration, is the head of the bureaucracy. However, it doesn't always work out that way. We have to remember that these career bureaucrats they're in post before a new president comes into office, and they're still there when he leaves office. So presidents come and go, but a lot of bureaucrats are there for good.
And then, of course, there's the media, isn't there?
Yes. Then, of course, there's the media, which, although it's not a formal institution of government, is one of the most important aspects of the American political process, particularly for a president, because the media, and although we include both the press and television, I think television is the more important of the two, the president needs television in order to be able to get his message directly to the American people. He doesn't want his words and ideas to be interpreted by a member of his party or a member of Congress or a journalist. He wants to speak directly to the American people to make sure that they get the message in the way that he intends it. However, the media, for its part, wants to get to the truth rather than simply to accept the president's version. So he can have problems with the media, although he can also use the media to his own advantage.
We'll come back to the media in a minute, but it's very intriguing, and I don't think I'm preempting what the presidents are going to say, but they see all of these relationships that you've just mentioned, the bureaucracy and the courts and the media. They see all of these relationships and these other institutions as really antagonistic and potentially, as it were, constraints on the power of the presidency, don't they?
Yes, because they stop him from doing what he wants to do. In a sense, we ought to have a great deal of sympathy for American presidents. They're expected to do a great deal. They're expected to cure all the major ills of the country. And yet each time they turn to the Congress or the bureaucracy or the courts for cooperation, that very often is withheld. Naturally, presidents would like these institutions to support and help, and quite frequently they don't. And that leaves the president almost incapable of carrying out what the people have elected him to do.
And yet these other institutions potentially could be enormous allies. They could be a vast resource for the presidency, couldn't they?
That's right. And the president does have some means of exercising influence with these institutions. For example, he is, as I've said, the head of the bureaucracy, so he has the power to hire and fire. And of course, he also appoints the political heads of each of these bureaucracies. With the Supreme Court, well, he does possess the power to nominate judges to the Supreme Court. But there you see, again, you see, on the other hand, he needs the consent of the Senate for his nominees. So nothing is simple.
And perhaps of all these institutions, the media arouses the greatest presidential anxiety and worries, and I'd imagine anger as well.
Yes, that's right. I remember that in the 1992 presidential election, President George Bush had a campaign sticker which said, "Annoy the media, elect George Bush." The reason for this was that Bush, and indeed other Republicans, have been convinced that the media is dominated by a liberal-thinking elite, a liberal elite which is out to get the president and to portray the president's policies in a bad light. So Republican presidents in particular tend to think of the press as a hostile element.
Thank you, Bob. Richard Nixon, of all the four presidents, had the most cause to be concerned about his relationship with the media. The interviewer, as before, is the eminent Washington correspondent Hugh Sidey.
For many years, journalists have found Richard Nixon to be a compelling politician when he was a congressman and when he was an unsuccessful candidate for governor of California.
And as I leave the press, all I can say is this. Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
Some people accuse the press of viewing this politician less as a news source and more as a target. Let's turn to another source of power in this age, and that's the media. Has it gotten too powerful?
I'd like to be just as objective as possible in talking about the role of the media. It is very important for a president or a cabinet officer or a congressman or a senator to be held accountable, to be kept on his toes. And the media today does that. The media is in an adversarial position with regard to public officials, and that is healthy in its way. On the other hand, we have to realize that a president, and we're referring only to the president at the moment, must not simply do the bidding of the media, because he was elected and they were not. Speaking of the media, too, we have to realize that, and I think this is frankly not a helpful development, and that is that television plays too much of a role today. I was shocked to see a poll a couple of years ago to the effect that 75% of the people polled said they made up their minds with regard to the candidates they were going to support from what they heard on television.
In campaigning, there's been some criticism that television encourages the quick line. You know, read my lips with Mr. Bush, and there have been others down the way, and that they get committed to things that they don't really believe in this way. Is there a distortion that you see in the campaign?
I liked the days in the 50s when the writing press was more dominant, because I could sit down with a good, intelligent writer, political writer, and talk to him on or off the record, and we could have a good dialogue. I would learn from it, and he would learn from it as well. But in television, what matters is some script writer will give you a clever line to say, and you've got to get it across in 10 to 15 or 20 seconds. And that line is all that people are going to remember, rather than your maybe very intelligent discussion for 2 or 3 minutes of a major issue. I mean, for example, we discussed something like the War Powers Act. You can't answer that with a quip. If you do, you're totally irresponsible. And yet television forces candidates to be sometimes certainly simplistic and sometimes even silly, because only by being silly sometimes can you really make the evening news. In a television age, how you look is more important than how you think, more important than what you say. Now, having said that, however, it means that when we select our candidates, we've got to remember that they must learn to use television. If they are unable to communicate on television, a president, for example, isn't going to be able to get support for his programs, and a candidate isn't going to be elected.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations.
Television is a two-edged sword for politicians, and Richard Nixon cited instances where it worked against him as well as for him.
The candidates need no introduction. the Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
Mr. President, there were a lot of people back in 1960 who listened to radio that said you beat John Kennedy in the first debate. The people who watched television because you'd been ill and many things, they said you didn't look as good as he did, and therefore the public ruled that he had won. Are you bitter about that?
No, I'm not bitter about it. That's something that we learned, that the importance of television. And John Kennedy was very good on television. He made a very good appearance on television. But I must say that I have had my moments on television, too. I saved my political career by going on television in the famous Fund speech back in 1952.
Oh, the Checkers speech.
The Checkers speech, so-called.
Not 1 cent of the $18,000 or any other money of that type ever went to me for my personal use.
In 1969, I made a speech to the nation, the so-called silent majority speech, which kept support for the Vietnam War until we were able to end it on a peaceful basis. So you can learn to use television.
What would you do looking back now as far as press conferences, speeches? What would you change, perhaps, over what you did when you were president?
Well, when I was president, I didn't have as many press conferences as I should have had because I can handle a press conference fairly well because I spend a lot of time preparing for press conferences. I don't do anything off the top of my head when I can avoid it. But during a war, it's very difficult to have a press conference. You simply can't be candid. And of course, during the so-called Watergate period, it was very difficult to have a press conference. But had I survived, I would have had far more press conferences. I would have had them on television whenever possible, because I'd rather have my views go directly to the people where they can hear me saying it, rather than having it filtered through anchormen or, frankly, writing press who give their views as to what I said.
Some scholars have suggested that adversarial relationship that you talked about had actually become destructive in some instances.
Well, let me be quite candid on that. Members of the press, whether the writing press or the television press, don't win prizes by programs or by articles or by books which are supportive or positive about the people they're writing about. I mean, you win prizes by being against rather than be for.
Well, is that good?
It's not good. It's not good. I think a lot of the responsibility there lies with the editors rather than with the reporters. If the editors would be a little bit more responsible, maybe we would get more honest and more objective reporting. I don't believe, incidentally, that you should have a cozy relationship between a president or a congressman and a reporter. It should be arm's length. It should be adversarial, because otherwise you're just going to have people that are going to pander to you. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be so adversarial that the president or the congressman and so forth is always on guard and figures, well, they're out to get me, and so I'm going to therefore not tell them what I really think.
In a world as complicated, difficult, and dangerous as we've got, should a president have some power to control the media? Should there be any restraint, in other words, on this huge thing called the media?
There probably should be, but I wouldn't be for it. I think once you start down that road, it's a very dangerous road. As irresponsible as the press is at times, and I believe it is, and the media is at times, it's far better not to have that kind of control.
President Carter broadly agrees with that conclusion, even though he too feels that the media were not especially helpful to his administration. Does he think that the media are too powerful?
I really don't think so. There have been scholarly analyses done and published in, I think, a book called The Presidential Quarterly that showed that my administration was treated more severely by the press than any other in this century, including President Nixon during the Watergate years. But even then, I never thought that it would be advisable to restrict the freedom or the influence or power of the press. The only way, really, that the president has to relay his views to the American people, to use his so-called bully pulpit, is through the press. The press in this country is basically self-correcting. It's not always accurate, with the pressures of deadlines and so forth. But if one particular medium does report an event erroneously, with great relish, their competitors in the news media jump on that mistake and publicize it. So I think the self-correcting nature of the press and the incisive analysis of what's going on in the internal affairs of government is very healthy. The White House press corps is basically combative. It's basically trying to trick the president into saying something that's ridiculous or foolish or ludicrous. The thing that I did that was very helpful to me was to have on Friday noon about 40 regional news representatives come into the cabinet room, editors of small newspapers, TV directors in regional places, and they would ask me a totally different kind of question.
You'd leap over that.
Leap over that, and what they ask is questions was sometimes very difficult to answer, but it also gave you a very good insight into what's going on in Des Moines. What are the people in Sarasota, Florida, worrying about? How's the logging industry being treated in Washington State? Those are the kind of questions you wouldn't get from the White House press corps, but you did get them when you invited those people to come into the White House. And that's what I did very regularly and consistently for 4 years.
President Reagan was once a journalist himself, but now he feels that the media have gone too far.
They're too irresponsible. They've got a responsibility of truth that they must stick to. I once, back in my school days, took a course in journalism and learned that one of the most important things was supposed to be that you could guarantee that what you said was true. Well, that has gone out the window long ago.
Why?
Well, I think just in the competition of the press with each other, somebody gets a story that he knows will make headline news and everybody will talk about it, and never mind whether it is responsible or whether it is true. Look at the war in Vietnam and the stories from out of there that were actually stories that were revealing to the enemy military secrets that were destructive to our forces or our purpose. And the same was true in other incidents. I can't tell you how many times I had to get on the phone to the head of another state while I was president, and on the basis of a story that had been told, and the usual thing, sources unknown, that couldn't be named, I had to get on the air and say to this other head of state, listen, this is another one of those leaked so-called secrets.
Well, now the press, Mr. President, would say, wait, the First Amendment guarantees us absolute freedom. Do you feel they've gone too far in invoking the First Amendment on all of these issues?
Well, yes, because the very fact that there are some things that are national security
and should take
the security of all the people should take precedent over
that freedom that's guaranteed. Mr. President, you had few press conferences, but they were quite major affairs. Would you handle it that way again if you could go back? I mean, do you have enough, do you think? Or
yes,
You've got a good deal of criticism, as you know, for not seeing the press formally enough.
Well, I know. but again, the press conferences were, I thought, did not serve the purpose they were created for. Actually, there was an adversarial relationship, and I wasn't asked legitimate public relations things or things that the people should know. They were adversarial questions. They were putting me in a position of self-defense. A number of times, we would send out around the country and bring in news editors from all over the country, not the Washington Press Corps. Well, I have to tell you, the difference between their questions and the Washington Press Corps was just unbelievable. They were asking legitimate questions for news and of interest that would be of interest to their people, not this hostile type of thing. And I enjoyed those press conferences very much.
President Ford also wasn't treated too kindly by the media. He was known as the accidental president. That was partly because he became vice president and then president as a result of midterm resignations. He was never elected to office. But he was also called the accidental president because of an unfortunate slip on an aircraft stairway, as you'll see.
Mr. President, there are, as you know, some experts who say the media has become almost a branch of government now. It is so pervasive, it affects the rhythm of the White House and the Congress every day. What's your attitude on that?
Well, presidents have to learn to live with the press, whether it's right or wrong. I happen to think the press today has an abnormal influence on the public, and through that impact, the press has an abnormal influence on the White House and the Congress.
What ways could it be?
Well, they develop opinions, they develop prejudices of the public by the way they report the news. And the public then responds. And members of Congress and the presidents respond to the public views.
A president is a public figure, a national celebrity. As such, he is the inevitable target of the world's comedians and cartoonists. No human foible goes unnoticed. There were some awful tough cartoons about you, Mr. President. How did you take the criticism? How do you deal with that?
Oh, I got used to it. Of course, the thing that I really used to laugh about, but I guess subjectively objected to, you know, every time I'd ski down one of these mountains and take a spill, that would be the picture.
You were night news then.
Not that I could navigate the toughest slopes, or if I bumped my head, some commentator would make some comment. Well, you know, you get immune, I think, after a period of time.
You let it roll off.
Yeah, if you let those things bother you, you're getting your focus on the wrong thing.
Well, Bob, it's clear that the presidents really don't like the media, do they?
Well, they don't like the media. On the other hand, some of them have been very adept at using the media to their own advantage. None more so than President Reagan, of course, who had had a career in the media and came to the White House very well equipped to understand what the media needed and how to give it to them. His communications advisor, Michael Deaver, once said something of tremendous importance. He said that television news journalists believe they were in the news business. Well, he said they're quite wrong. They're in the entertainment business. Now, presidents can create wonderful entertainment for the media. They have all the symbols of office. They have the White House. They can create nice little scenarios with the president doing this or that with some constituents somewhere. And so a president who has advisors who know how to construct an entertainment with the president at center stage can use the media to great effect, to great political effect.
I remember that wonderful, what do they call it, photo opportunity on the anniversary of D-Day with President Reagan standing on the beaches of Normandy. I think it was a windy day. And I think he was in a general's uniform, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right. And actually, I've seen footage of what went on before Reagan actually gave the speech that day. And, you know, there were white tape marks put out. The president was supposed to stand in exactly this place to say this line, and then he would turn. It was, in the words of Michael Lever again, choreographed. And if you can choreograph a wonderful entertainment for the media, then you can have the media eating out of your hands.
But yet, despite his success, President Reagan, and indeed all the presidents, clearly feel that the press and television are unfair to presidents in general, and to them in particular.
Yes, it's not only American politicians who feel this. I suspect most politicians feel this, largely because they have a different goal from the media. The media wants a story, but the media also wants to get at the truth. if it can. And that means it may wish to discover things which are harmful to the president. The president, for his part, prefers the media to take the message that the president wishes people to receive. So there is inherently an antagonistic relationship between the president and the media.
Constitutionally, I think most of the presidents accept that there's not much they can do about it.
No, of course, the American Constitution contains the famous First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech and implicitly freedom of press, so that there is very little that any president can do to restrict what the media says.
Thank you, Bob.